It started like any other day in the dusty archives, a quiet morning filled with the smell of old paper and history. A team of art historians was sifting through recently donated collections, looking for pieces that spoke to the early 20th century. One particular portrait stood out. It was a simple, unassuming oil painting from 1910, depicting a woman in a high-collared dress, her gaze serene and distant. Nothing about it screamed mystery or anomaly. It was just a snapshot of a forgotten life, a peaceful portrait from a time long past. The researchers, mostly focused on the brushstrokes and the fashion of the era, were initially drawn to it for its sheer artistic merit. It captured the light in a way that felt authentic, a genuine representation of the period. They talked about its quiet beauty, how the artist managed to convey so much emotion with such subtle detail. It was a good find, a solid piece for their upcoming exhibition on early photographic influences in painting. They catalogued it, took preliminary scans, and moved on, satisfied with their discovery. But then, one afternoon, while running a routine high-resolution scan to capture every pigment and crackle for digital preservation, Dr. Evelyn Reed noticed something. It was small, almost imperceptible, hidden in the woman's shadow on the wall behind her. A tiny distortion, a ripple where there should have been smooth, uniform darkness. Evelyn zoomed in, then zoomed out. It flickered in her peripheral vision, a trick of the light, she thought, or maybe just a flaw in the old canvas. She dismissed it, attributing it to the imperfections inherent in antique art or the digital scanner's calibration. Her mind, trained in logic and historical fact, sought the simplest explanation, yet the image kept pulling at her. That little ripple, that almost nothing, stayed in her mind. It was like a word on the tip of your tongue, something you know is there but can't quite grasp. She found herself going back to the digital file, looking at the shadow again, then again. It was still there, a faint blur that didn't quite match the elegant curve of the woman's form. It didn't look like a brushstroke error. It didn't look like a crack in the paint. It looked different. This subtle detail was the first spark, the tiny ember that would soon ignite a much larger and more unsettling fire. The genesis of doubt began to form in Evelyn's mind. She showed it to Dr. Ben Carter, the head of the department, a man known for his skepticism. He squinted at the screen, adjusted his glasses, and offered a few technical explanations: a reflection artifact, a minor photographic imperfection, perhaps even a slight warp in the canvas that created an optical illusion. He was quick to point out that even the most skilled artists could make mistakes, but even Ben, after a moment, paused. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. The anomaly, while tiny, defied simple, straightforward explanation. It wasn't a glaring error, but its very subtlety made it harder to ignore. It felt less like a flaw and more like a deliberate, if obscure, detail. This nagging curiosity, this shared unease, led to a crucial decision. They would apply advanced digital analysis to the portrait. This was beyond their usual art history methods. They would use techniques typically reserved for forensics or deep space imaging, pushing past mere visual inspection. They wanted to strip away the layers of time and paint to see what lay beneath the surface, to understand why this shadow felt so wrong. It was a chance to use cutting-edge technology on a century-old mystery. They fed the high-resolution scans into powerful computers, running algorithms designed to detect minute variations in light, texture, and density. The initial results of the digital analysis were immediate and unsettling. The shadow, when magnified and processed, showed unusual characteristics. It wasn't just a simple absence of light. There was a strange depth to it, a non-uniformity that didn't align with how light and shadow typically behave. It was denser in some areas, almost textured, in a way that didn't correspond to the woman's figure or the background wall. The algorithms flagged it as an anomaly, a significant deviation from expected photographic norms for a painted shadow from that period. It confirmed Evelyn's initial gut feeling. Something was genuinely off. This wasn't a trick of the eye or a simple flaw. This established the central mystery. What was wrong with this shadow? And more importantly, what did it reveal? The portrait, which had initially been admired for its serene beauty, now held a growing sense of dread. Its quiet charm was being replaced by a chilling question mark. The woman's calm face, once so appealing, now seemed to hide a secret, a silent complicity with the strange darkness behind her. The unsettling beauty of the image was suddenly amplified by this emerging, inexplicable detail. What secrets, they wondered, could an old photograph truly hold, especially when its shadows began to tell their own story? And what would happen when those secrets finally came to light? The team moved quickly, driven by a mix of scientific curiosity and a growing sense of unease. They employed a suite of advanced digital enhancement and analysis techniques. First, they used spectral imaging, a method that captures light beyond the visible spectrum. This allowed them to see layers and details that the human eye, or even a standard camera, couldn't pick up. Then came photogrammetry, creating a 3D model of the painted surface, which helped distinguish between actual surface textures and painted illusions. They also ran algorithms designed for shadow analysis, which normally helped determine light sources and object shapes in complex images. These algorithms, however, kept returning peculiar results for the woman's shadow, almost as if they were trying to map a shape that didn't quite make sense. Initially, they considered various scientific and artistic theories to explain the shadow's strangeness. Maybe it was a pigment interaction, an unusual chemical reaction in the paint over time. Perhaps the artist, for some unknown reason, had used a non-standard medium for that particular part of the painting. One theory suggested a restoration attempt gone wrong, where a previous restorer might have used an incompatible material that aged differently. Art historians on the team hypothesized that it could be a symbolic element, a subtle artistic choice meant to convey something abstract about the woman's character or situation. Each hypothesis, however, crumbled under the weight of the digital evidence. The data was too consistent, too specific in its oddness, to be easily dismissed by conventional explanations. Under extreme magnification, the shadow revealed an unnatural density and form. It wasn't just a flat, painted area. It had a peculiar, almost granular texture that didn't match the smooth brushstrokes of the wall behind it or the woman's dress. It looked like a solid, albeit very thin, substance. The edges, instead of blending softly, had microscopic irregularities, almost like tiny, jagged peaks and valleys. It defied the logic of how paint settled and dried. It was as if the shadow was made of a different material entirely, something that had been applied with a different technique, or perhaps something that had grown there. Further analysis showed anomalous light absorption. Normal shadows simply block or reduce light. This shadow, however, seemed to absorb light in a way that was inconsistent with a normal cast shadow or even a dark pigment. When they shone different wavelengths of light onto the digital image, the shadow reacted unusually. It didn't reflect light in predictable patterns. Instead, it seemed to soak it in, leaving a darker, more profound void than mere darkness should create. It was like looking into a patch of space that was actively pulling light into itself rather than simply being devoid of it. This was a concept that baffled the physicists on the team. This led to a new and unsettling idea. The shadow wasn't merely an absence of light, but an active, almost tangible presence. It was as if something was there, materializing just enough to cast a specific kind of darkness. It wasn't a void. It was a negative space that had taken on a form of its own. Dr. Carter, usually so grounded in scientific fact, started using words like imprint and residue in hushed tones. It felt less like a painted detail and more like the lingering mark of something that had once occupied that space, something that had left its shadow behind in a way that defied the laws of physics and art. The most disturbing discovery was how the shadow seemed to subtly warp the background textures behind it. Through sophisticated layering analysis, they found that the painted wall directly behind the shadow showed minute distortions. The subtle pattern of the wallpaper, or the faint texture of the plaster, seemed to bend inwards around the shadow's edges. It wasn't a major, obvious deformation, but a slight, almost imperceptible pull, like a faint ripple in water. This hinted at a localized disruption, as if the shadow wasn't just on the surface, but was exerting some kind of force on the canvas itself, subtly altering its physical properties. It was a detail that sent shivers down their spines. Then came the first chilling detail. Within the unnatural density of the shadow, a faint, almost subliminal shape began to resolve itself. It wasn't a clear image, more like a suggestion, a fleeting impression caught just at the edge of perception. It looked like a cluster of tiny, thread-like structures, or perhaps a miniature, gnarled outline, impossible to clearly define, but undeniably present. It was too intricate, too specific, to be random noise or a paint splatter. It was a pattern, an internal structure within the shadow itself, a hidden design that seemed to be trying to emerge. This was no longer just an anomaly, it was a signature. The researchers' focus shifted almost entirely to the shadow. Other aspects of the portrait, the woman's clothes, her expression, the background details, faded into the background. The shadow became their obsession. They spent countless hours adjusting parameters, running new scans, trying to isolate and clarify that faint internal shape. Sleep became a luxury, and their conversations revolved solely around the strange darkness. The initial scientific curiosity had morphed into something more intense, more consuming. They were no longer just studying an artifact. They were trying to decipher a message, a secret encoded in painted darkness. The more they analyzed, the more they realized that conventional physics could not fully explain the observed phenomena. They brought in experts from other fields, material scientists, optical engineers, even a theoretical physicist. Each one offered their specialized insights, but none could provide a complete, coherent explanation that fit all the data. The shadow's light absorption, its density, the warping of the background, and especially that internal structure, defied every known scientific principle for painted images. It was a scientific dead end, a phenomenon that simply shouldn't exist according to their understanding of the world. This realization marked a significant shift in the narrative. They had crossed a threshold. The inquiry had moved from purely scientific analysis to the acknowledgement of something beyond current understanding. It was no longer about art history or photographic anomalies. It was about something else entirely, something that touched upon the inexplicable. The team, once grounded in empirical data, found themselves standing at the edge of a mystery that hinted at forces they couldn't measure, principles they couldn't grasp. The portrait, once a serene object of study, had become a gateway to the unknown, and the shadow, its silent guardian, was now beckoning them deeper into its unsettling secrets. With their scientific tools reaching a dead end, the researchers knew they had to change their approach. The shadow wasn't giving up its secrets to microscopes and algorithms alone. They needed context, history, something that could explain the impossible. Their focus shifted from the pixels and light waves to dusty archives and forgotten records. It was time for some serious archival digging. They started with the most obvious question: who was the woman in the portrait? The museum had some basic information, a name, a rough date for the painting, but little else. They cast a wider net, contacting local historical societies, old family records, even church registries from the region where the portrait was believed to have been painted. Slowly, painstakingly, pieces of the woman's identity began to surface. Her name was Eliza Vance. She had lived in a small, quiet village in rural England, a place largely untouched by the industrial boom of the era. The records were sparse, as was common for ordinary people in 1910. They found her birth certificate, a marriage record, and eventually a death certificate. She had lived a seemingly unremarkable life, marrying a local farmer, having 2 children, and then dying relatively young, in her late 30s, just a few years after the portrait was made. No scandals, no great achievements, nothing that immediately screamed supernatural shadow. Yet the very normalcy of her life, contrasted with the abnormality of her shadow, made it all the more unsettling. As they dug deeper into the village's history, they started unearthing local legends and folklore. Every small, isolated community has its stories, and this one was no different. They found tales of shadow folk who lived in the deep woods, spirits who could attach themselves to people, especially those who were melancholic or vulnerable. There were mentions of old pagan rituals, long since suppressed by the church, that involved offerings to unseen entities in exchange for certain favors. One particularly eerie legend spoke of a witch who, centuries ago, had made a pact with a dark twin that would follow her and her descendants, granting them small powers but demanding a terrible price. These were just stories, of course, but the researchers couldn't shake the feeling that they were brushing against something relevant. They also stumbled upon a few parallel anomalies from the same locale and time period. Nothing as dramatic as the shadow, but strange enough to raise eyebrows. A series of unexplained livestock deaths, where the animals appeared to have simply wasted away, leaving no obvious cause of death. A rash of sudden, deep depressions among villagers, sometimes leading to self-harm, often striking people who were otherwise cheerful. A few reports of strange, fleeting shapes seen at dusk, just at the edge of the woods, dismissed by most as tricks of the light or overactive imaginations. Individually, these were minor historical oddities. Together, they painted a picture of a community that might have been more susceptible to the unexplained than they initially thought. Next, their investigation turned to the photographer who captured the image of Eliza Vance. His name was Arthur Finch, a traveling portrait photographer who moved from village to village. They found his old ledgers, meticulously kept, detailing his clients and their locations. Finch himself seemed ordinary enough, a skilled craftsman with a good reputation. However, one detail stood out. He often stayed in the same villages for longer than strictly necessary, sometimes weeks or even months, despite the dwindling number of potential clients. And in his personal notes, scattered through the ledgers, were strange, cryptic entries, not about his photography, but about the stillness, the weight in the air, and a recurring phrase, the places where the veil thins. He never elaborated, and eventually, he disappeared from the records altogether, his last entry simply stating, "Leaving for the north, the shadows grow restless." The challenge of piecing together these fragmented records was immense. Many documents were faded, barely legible. Some families were reluctant to share old papers, viewing them as private. The information was incomplete, full of gaps, forcing the researchers to make educated guesses and draw connections where none were explicitly stated. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing and the remaining ones covered in dust. But with each new piece, no matter how small, the picture became a little clearer and a little more disturbing. Then came the first disquieting connection. One of the local legends spoke of a specific family line, known for a subtle melancholia and a tendency to attract unseen companions. This family, the story went, had a matriarch centuries ago who had indeed made a desperate pact. The family name in the legend was remarkably similar to Eliza's maiden name, though with a slightly different spelling due to archaic transcription. Further digging revealed that Eliza Vance's mother was indeed from that ancient family line. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a chilling coincidence, a subtle link between the woman's life and a local legend involving shadows and apparitions. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up. A growing sense of foreboding began to settle over the research team. What had started as an academic puzzle was slowly transforming into something else entirely. They were no longer just historians or scientists. They felt like archaeologists uncovering an ancient forgotten tomb, aware that what they were unearthing might be better left undisturbed. The cheerful hum of scientific discovery had been replaced by a quiet, almost fearful determination. The more they learned about Eliza Vance and her village, the more they felt like they were intruding on something sacred, or perhaps something cursed. The historical records, though incomplete, were starting to tell a story far beyond their surface meaning. It wasn't just about Eliza Vance, the woman in the portrait. It was about a place, a time, and perhaps a lineage burdened by a secret. The shadow in the portrait wasn't just a random anomaly. It was a character in this unseen narrative, a silent testament to a history that had been deliberately forgotten or suppressed. And then, a specific detail from the past echoed with the shadow's mystery, a resonant detail that seemed to tie everything together. In one of the old church records, alongside a baptism entry for a child from Eliza's ancestral line, there was a tiny, almost illegible handwritten note in the margin. It simply said, "Beware the second shade." The meaning was unclear, possibly a local idiom or a private warning, but the word shade resonated deeply. The internal shape they had found within Eliza's shadow, the second shade that defied scientific explanation, now had a haunting historical precursor. The portrait wasn't just showing a physical shadow, it was hinting at a legacy, a burden, a whispered warning from the past that had finally found an audience. The unsettling observation began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Under continued digital scrutiny, the shadow in Eliza Vance's portrait appeared to subtly change, to intensify. It wasn't a sudden dramatic shift, but a gradual deepening of its darkness, a slight increase in its perceived density on the screen. It was as if the shadow was not a static element, but a living, breathing entity, slowly gathering strength. The researchers, already on edge from their historical discoveries, found themselves constantly checking and rechecking the digital files, convinced they were imagining things. But the data didn't lie. The shadow was evolving. Then came the emergence of form. It was distinct, yet fleeting, a perception that danced on the edge of vision. Within the deepest parts of the shadow, a non-human shape seemed to coalesce, only to dissolve again. It wasn't a clear figure, nothing as defined as a face or a limb, but rather an impression, a suggestion of something vaguely humanoid, yet utterly alien. One researcher described it as seeing a ripple in dark water, but the ripple itself was the thing moving. Another swore they saw 2 points of light, like eyes, briefly materializing before vanishing. These moments were short, often lasting only a fraction of a second, but they were enough to cement the growing fear that the shadow held more than just darkness. As their work intensified, strange things started happening in the lab. These weren't dramatic events, but rather persistent, unsettling sensory anomalies. Cold spots would suddenly appear in the room, making a specific area noticeably colder than the rest, only to dissipate moments later. Faint, unidentifiable smells would drift through the air, sometimes like damp earth, other times a cloying sweetness, then disappear as quickly as they came. And there were auditory disturbances, soft, almost inaudible whispers just at the edge of hearing, or the faint sound of fabric rustling when no one was moving. These occurrences were dismissed at first as drafts, pipes, or overworked imaginations, but they became more frequent, more pronounced, always seeming to happen when the portrait was being actively analyzed, or when a researcher was alone with the digital files. The psychological strain on the team grew with each passing day. Their scientific objectivity, once a sturdy shield, was now cracking under the relentless pressure of the inexplicable. They were trained to deal with facts, with measurable phenomena, not with cold spots and whispering shadows. Doubts began to creep in, not about their methods, but about their sanity. Were they sleep-deprived? Were they experiencing mass hysteria? Yet the evidence, both digital and anecdotal, continued to mount, making self-doubt a luxury they couldn't afford. The line between rational explanation and terrifying reality blurred. For one researcher, Dr. Anya Sharma, the strain manifested in a more personal, disturbing way. She began experiencing recurring nightmares directly related to the shadow and the woman in the portrait. In these dreams, Eliza Vance's eyes would follow her, not with sadness, but with a deep, unsettling hunger. The shadow would rise from the portrait, not as a flat image, but as a swirling vortex of darkness, reaching out, pulling her in. She would wake up in a cold sweat, the feeling of dread clinging to her, unable to shake the images from her mind. These weren't just bad dreams, they felt like direct communications, warnings, or perhaps invitations. The team's growing conviction was that an unseen presence was actively manifesting through the portrait. It wasn't just an image, it was a doorway, or perhaps a prison for something that was now stirring. The digital analysis was no longer just a tool for understanding. It felt like a way of poking and prodding at something dormant, waking it up. The portrait itself seemed to radiate a palpable sense of unease, even when it was just a file on a screen. The transition from academic curiosity to genuine fear was complete. No longer were they excited by the prospect of a groundbreaking discovery. Now they were simply scared. The discussions in the lab, once lively and intellectual, became hushed and tense. Jokes were rare, smiles even rarer. The fear of the unknown, of something that defied their understanding and threatened their very sense of reality, had taken root. The idea that the portrait itself was becoming a conduit or focal point for something malevolent became a dominant theory. It was no longer just a historical artifact. It was an active participant, a vessel. The shadow wasn't just in the portrait, it was the portrait, or at least a part of its essence. It felt like a living thing, drawing power, growing stronger with every moment of attention it received. There were initial, unsuccessful attempts by some researchers to disengage from the project due to increasing unease. One assistant, a bright young intern, simply stopped showing up, citing personal reasons that everyone understood meant the portrait. Another senior researcher requested a transfer to a different department, claiming burnout. But for the core team, for those who had seen the most, experienced the most, there was an irresistible pull. The mystery of the shadow had become an inescapable obsession. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also utterly captivating. They felt compelled to see it through, to understand what they had awakened, even if it meant sacrificing their peace of mind, or perhaps something far more sinister. They were caught, entangled in the shadow's web, unable to turn away. The relentless pull of the shadow was undeniable, but to understand its nature, the researchers knew they had to understand the woman it clung to. They had only fragments of Eliza Vance's life, just enough to give her a name and a year. Now they needed more. They needed to uncover the layers of her existence, to find what might have tethered such a profound darkness to her image. This meant a deeper dive into her personal life, her relationships, and her state of mind around 1910. The archives, already scoured, were revisited with a new, more desperate lens. They looked for diaries, letters, local newspaper clippings, anything that could offer a glimpse beyond the serene facade of the portrait. What they found was not a dramatic scandal, but a quiet, pervasive sorrow. Eliza Vance had lost her husband, a local carpenter, just 2 years before the portrait was taken. He had died suddenly, unexpectedly, from a virulent fever that swept through their small town. His death had left her alone, without children, and with a small, struggling homestead. The records indicated a period of profound isolation and withdrawal after his passing. She rarely left her home, and when she did, her neighbors described her as distant, almost ethereal. This hidden grief, this deep, unaddressed trauma began to form a clearer picture. It wasn't just sadness, it was a wound that had never healed, festering beneath the surface of her quiet life. Further digging into local records and oral histories revealed something else. Eliza Vance was somewhat of a local outcast, not in a malicious way, but she was definitely misunderstood and perhaps even feared by her community. She was known for her solitary walks in the woods, for collecting strange herbs, and for an unusual affinity for nighttime. Children were often warned to stay away from Eliza's cottage after dark. Whispers of her being a wise woman or even a witch were common, though never openly stated. She wasn't shunned aggressively, but she was certainly isolated, living on the fringes of acceptable society, burdened by her loss and seen as different. From these same local legends and folklore, a chilling theory began to emerge, one that Dr. Sharma had initially dismissed as fanciful, but now considered with a grim seriousness. Old tales spoke of desperate individuals making bargains in moments of profound grief or need. These pacts, often made with unseen forces or spirits of the earth, promised solace or power, but always at a terrible cost. The shadow, according to these stories, could be a consequence of such a desperate act or pact she made. Had Eliza, in her unbearable loneliness and despair, sought comfort or a way to cling to what she had lost, and paid a price that manifested as this spectral companion? They began re-examining the woman's posture and expression in the portrait, not just for artistic merit, but for hidden meanings or clues. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, almost protectively. Her gaze, while seemingly calm, now seemed to hold a deep, knowing sadness. A resignation. Was the slight tilt of her head a gesture of weary acceptance, or a subtle sign of deference to something unseen? Her dark dress, once just a fashion of the time, now felt heavy, almost like a shroud. Every detail under this new theory took on a symbolic weight. One crucial, almost glaring discovery was the missing element. Despite her husband's death, there was no record of her attending his funeral, no mention of her name in the list of mourners. It was as if she had vanished during that critical period, only to reappear later, changed. This absence, so conspicuous in records that meticulously documented local events, spoke volumes. What had she been doing during those days of deepest grief? Where had she gone, and with whom? The pieces, though still fragmented, began to coalesce into a terrifying mosaic. The dawning realization was that the shadow was not just an anomaly, a trick of light, or a digital glitch. It was intrinsically linked to the woman's story, a living testament to her past, her choices, and her suffering. It was not a random occurrence. It was a consequence. The weight of her past, her secrets, her fate, all of it seemed to be manifest in that strange, dark shape beside her. The shadow was not just of her, it was her burden, her chosen companion, or perhaps her eternal prison. The idea that the shadow reflected a dark aspect of her inner world became increasingly plausible. Her grief, her isolation, her possible desperation, these were the fertile grounds for an entity to take root, to become a part of her very being. It was a mirror of her soul, reflecting not the calm exterior she presented to the world, but the churning darkness within. The more they uncovered about Eliza Vance, the more the shadow seemed to make a terrible kind of sense, and finally the painful truth about the woman's life began to give the shadow a terrifying new context. Eliza Vance, a woman consumed by grief and isolated by local superstition, had made a choice. What that choice was, they didn't yet precisely know, but the shadow was its undeniable, enduring mark. It wasn't just a shadow, it was the embodiment of her agony, a silent, chilling monument to a life irrevocably altered by loss and a desperate, perhaps foolish pact. The portrait was not merely a picture of a woman from 1910. It was a window into a soul that had touched something ancient and terrible, and the shadow was the proof. The digital analysis now showed something deeply unsettling. The shadow, previously confined to the shape it cast, seemed to be subtly spreading or influencing the pixels around it. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic jump, but a slow, almost imperceptible bleed, like ink seeping into paper. The edges of the shadow itself appeared softer, less defined, as if its substance was becoming more diffuse, expanding its reach into the background of the portrait. It was a change that, once noticed, could not be unseen. The frame around the woman, the textures of the wall behind her, even the subtle patterns in her dress, all seemed to have a faint, almost invisible fuzziness at their borders where they met the shadow. It was as if the shadow was actively corrupting the digital information around it. More disturbing still was the discovery of a measurable, albeit minuscule, energy drain. The equipment used to analyze the portrait, especially the dedicated server running continuous scans, showed a consistent, slight drop in power efficiency whenever the digital image was actively displayed or processed. It wasn't enough to trip circuit breakers or cause system failures, but it was there, a steady trickle of energy disappearing into what seemed like nothing. The researchers, initially baffled, started running diagnostics on the power grid of the lab itself. Everything was normal. The only variable was the portrait. This wasn't just a visual anomaly, it was having a physical effect, however small, on its environment. The influence wasn't limited to digital files and power readings. More researchers, and even the cleaning staff who occasionally entered the lab, began to report feeling inexplicably drained, anxious, or unwell after prolonged exposure to the portrait. Dr. Aris, usually a man of boundless energy, found himself struggling to concentrate, often feeling a profound sense of weariness that sleep couldn't fix. Maria, the junior researcher who spent hours enhancing the shadow's details, complained of constant headaches and a pervasive feeling of sadness. Even the cleaning lady, a cheerful woman named Elena, mentioned a cold dread she felt whenever she had to dust the room where the portrait's main display screen was located, a room she now actively avoided. The team's ability to think clearly or focus began to degrade. What started as simple fatigue turned into a subtle mental fog. Arguments over trivial details became more frequent. Ideas that once flowed freely now felt like pulling teeth. They found themselves staring blankly at screens, losing track of their thoughts. It was as if their mental faculties were being slowly eroded, their sharpness blunted. This wasn't just stress from a difficult project. It felt like an external force was actively clouding their minds. They tried to take breaks, to distance themselves, but the feeling persisted, a persistent hum of mental exhaustion. The shadow seemed to exert a strange hypnotic pull. Despite the growing unease, despite the physical and mental toll, they found it difficult to look away from the portrait. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was an almost primal urge to keep staring, to keep analyzing. It was like a dangerous current pulling them closer to a whirlpool. They felt compelled to understand it, to solve its mystery, even as it actively seemed to be draining them. The portrait had become an inescapable focal point, a silent siren song. There was also a persistent feeling that the shadow was feeding on negative emotions, drawing despair from its surroundings. When someone in the lab felt particularly stressed or sad, it seemed the shadow on the screen would subtly darken, or its edges would appear to soften even more. It was a subjective observation, hard to quantify, but the correlation was uncanny. It felt like a parasitic entity, growing stronger on their anxieties and fears. The air in the lab often felt heavy, thick with an unspoken melancholy. The unseen tendrils of the shadow's influence were insidious and pervasive. It touched everything around it, not just the people directly interacting with the portrait. Lab equipment malfunctioned inexplicably. Minor errors in data collection became more common, and a general sense of misfortune seemed to cling to the research team. It wasn't a curse, not in the dramatic sense, but a slow, creeping decay, a subtle unraveling of order. Then came the first physical injury, minor but startling. Dr. Elias Vance, while carefully moving the original photographic plate of the portrait, felt a sharp, burning pain on his forearm. He dropped the plate, thankfully, onto a padded surface. When he looked at his arm, there was a thin, perfectly straight red line, like a paper cut, but deeper, as if drawn by something incredibly fine and sharp. He hadn't touched anything sharp. He'd been wearing gloves. It was as if the very air around the plate had lashed out. He dismissed it as an accident, a momentary lapse, but the incident lingered, adding to the growing sense of dread. The team decided to retreat and reassess. The portrait, both the original plate and the main digital display, was moved to a shielded, isolated room, accessible only by keycard and under strict protocols. Direct interaction was limited to short, scheduled intervals. They recognized its dangerous nature, acknowledging that their scientific curiosity had led them down a path far more perilous than they had imagined. The portrait was no longer just an object of study. It was a hazard. The chilling realization dawned on them. The shadow was not passive. It was not merely a historical anomaly or a digital illusion. It was actively seeking to expand its influence. It was a hungry entity, drawing sustenance from their energy, their emotions, and perhaps their very sanity. The portrait was not just a window into the past, it was a gateway, and something was actively trying to push through. The growing threat was no longer theoretical, it was tangible, and it was getting stronger. They had spent weeks trying to understand it, and now it seemed it was starting to understand them. The researchers, now truly terrified, began a desperate search for a solution. Their scientific methods had led them to this terrifying dead end, and it was clear that conventional approaches were useless. They needed something more, something beyond the realm of physics and digital analysis. With heavy hearts and a growing sense of desperation, they reluctantly turned to experts in paranormal phenomena, folklore, and even, in hushed conversations, considered the possibility of seeking out those who claimed to practice exorcism. It felt like a betrayal of everything they stood for as scientists, but the alternative was to simply let this thing consume them, or worse, escape. They consulted obscure texts, dusty archives, and even reached out to cultural anthropologists specializing in ancient belief systems. Their search led them to uncover ancient warnings, forgotten local traditions that spoke of similar shadow entities, and methods of protection or banishment that sounded more like fairy tales than scientific protocols. There were stories of places where shadows held malevolent power, where the absence of light was not just a physical state, but a living, hungry presence. These old stories, once dismissed as superstition, now held a terrifying resonance. They found accounts of rituals involving specific symbols, certain plants, or even specific times of the day or night that were believed to weaken such entities. One particular set of texts, unearthed from a remote village library, spoke of a binding ritual that required an object of personal significance to the afflicted, an act of intentional severance, and the invocation of protective wards. It was all very vague, full of metaphor and archaic language, but it was the closest thing they had found to a practical guide. The team, led by Dr. Aris Thorne, who had initially been the most skeptical, now found himself poring over these texts with a desperate intensity. He felt a personal responsibility for having pushed the research so far, for having opened this particular Pandora's box. As they began to piece together a potential strategy based on these ancient warnings, the shadow seemed to fight back with renewed fury. The disturbances in the lab intensified. The inexplicable cold spots became colder, the feeling of being watched more pervasive. Digital files related to the portrait would corrupt themselves, screens would flicker violently, and the strange hum in the air grew louder, more menacing. It was as if the shadow sensed their intentions, understood their plan to confront it, and was actively resisting. The psychological toll increased dramatically. Sleep became almost impossible for some of the team, plagued by vivid, unsettling dreams that felt too real, too personal. It was no longer just about studying an anomaly. It was a battle. The personal stakes for Dr. Thorne became particularly high. He had been the one to insist on pushing the digital analysis to its limits, the one who had felt the initial pull of the shadow most strongly. He began to feel a growing connection to the woman in the portrait, a strange empathy for her unspoken suffering that he couldn't shake. He started to believe that to truly contain the shadow, he needed to understand the woman's pain, to somehow address the source of its power. He decided he needed to be the one to perform the ritual, to take the dangerous risk. It was an irrational decision, driven by guilt and a strange sense of obligation. But the other researchers, seeing his conviction and feeling their own fear, didn't argue. They were too exhausted, too desperate for any glimmer of hope. The moment of truth arrived on a moonless night, as prescribed by the ancient texts. They had painstakingly recreated the protective wards, drawn symbols on the floor around the isolated portrait, and gathered the necessary implements: a small, antique mirror that had belonged to the woman in the portrait, and a small, sharp silver blade meant for symbolic severance. Dr. Thorne stood before the portrait, his hands trembling slightly, the air thick with tension, and the low, menacing hum that now filled the room. He began to recite the archaic words he had memorized, his voice surprisingly steady despite the fear gnawing at him. As he spoke, the shadow in the digital display of the portrait began to writhe. It pulsed with a dark, malevolent energy, expanding beyond its usual confines, distorting the entire image. The room plunged into an unnatural cold, so intense it felt like his bones were freezing. The hum became a deafening roar, a cacophony of whispers and guttural sounds that seemed to emanate directly from the shadow itself. The shadow's fury was palpable, a terrifying, active resistance. It lashed out, causing objects in the room to fly across the floor, furniture to rattle violently. The protective wards around them flickered, straining against an unseen force. For a terrifying minute, it seemed the shadow would overwhelm them entirely. The other researchers, huddled behind a makeshift barrier, watched in horror as Dr. Thorne staggered, almost falling, his face contorted in pain as if something was physically pressing down on him. The roar intensified, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and despair. It was the brink of failure. All hope seemed lost. The shadow gathered itself, forming a vaguely humanoid shape within the portrait, its eyes, or where eyes should be, burning with an infernal light. It was coming for them. Just as Dr. Thorne seemed about to collapse, he saw something within the shadow, a flicker, a momentary hesitation, a faint glimmer of hope. He pushed through the pain, remembered the woman's story, her hidden grief. He held up the antique mirror, reflecting the shadow back at itself, and with the silver blade, symbolically cut the cord that bound it to its past. The room fell silent as suddenly as it had erupted in chaos. The deafening roar vanished, replaced by an eerie, profound quiet. The unnatural cold lifted, leaving behind a lingering chill that was more a memory than a present sensation. Dr. Thorne, gasping for breath, dropped the silver blade, which clattered on the floor with surprising loudness in the stillness. The antique mirror slipped from his grasp, falling face down, its reflective surface now hidden. He leaned heavily against the makeshift altar, his body trembling, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. The shadow in the portrait was different. It was still there, a dark smudge where the woman's shadow should be, but it no longer pulsed with malevolence. It was dim, almost faded, a mere whisper of its former terrifying self. The distinct, vaguely humanoid shape had dissolved, leaving only an indistinct blotch. The portrait itself seemed to sigh, the pixels on the digital display settling back into their normal, static arrangement. The immediate consequences of the confrontation were clear. The shadow was altered, diminished, contained. It was not entirely gone, but its active, aggressive presence had been neutralized. The researchers slowly emerged from their hiding spots, their faces pale, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. They looked at Dr. Thorne, then at the portrait, then back at him, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The lasting psychological and emotional impact on the team was profound. They had faced something beyond their scientific understanding, something that had challenged their very perception of reality. Dr. Thorne, in particular, carried a permanent scar. The connection he had felt to the woman, the overwhelming despair he had briefly experienced during the confrontation, had etched itself onto his soul. He had glimpsed true darkness, and that kind of vision doesn't just fade away. Despite the relative calm, lingering mysteries about the shadow's true origin and nature remained. They had contained it, yes, but they hadn't fully understood it. Was it truly the woman's grief made manifest, or something else entirely, something far older and more sinister that had merely latched onto her suffering? The ancient texts had offered a solution for containment, not for complete eradication or explanation. The source of the hum, the specific shapes within the shadow, the exact nature of its hunger, these questions hung in the air, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. The portrait's new status was undeniable. It was no longer just a historical artifact. It was a dangerous, cursed object. They couldn't simply put it back in a museum or store it in a regular archive. It had to be secured, isolated, its presence acknowledged but never underestimated. The team decided to encase the original painting in a specially constructed, shielded container, placed in a secure, undisclosed location far from any human contact. The digital files were wiped from all public servers and stored on encrypted, offline drives, accessible only to a select few with the highest clearance. They also made a critical decision to document their findings and the portrait's true nature as a cautionary tale, not for public consumption, but for future generations of researchers, for those who might one day stumble upon similar anomalies. Their detailed reports, filled with their scientific data, their historical research, and their harrowing personal accounts, became a sealed record, a warning about the thin veil between worlds and the dangers of disturbing what lies beyond. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about protecting others from the terrifying truth they had uncovered, the unsettling possibility that the shadow's influence might still linger, or that other similar anomalies existed weighed heavily on them. They had contained one, but how many other portraits, how many other objects, might harbor such latent darkness, waiting for the right conditions to awaken? The experience had fundamentally altered their worldview, transforming them from dispassionate scientists into wary guardians of a fragile reality. Every old photograph, every antique object, now seemed to hold a potential secret, a hidden depth of unknown power. The woman's unresolved fate was another heavy burden. They had addressed the shadow, the manifestation of her agony, but her suffering, though perhaps contained in its physical expression, was never truly alleviated. Her story remained one of profound sadness, a life touched by a darkness that had reached across a century. Dr. Thorne often wondered if, in some ethereal way, a part of her was still trapped, still yearning for peace. The ritual had been a practical measure, a containment, not a redemption. The cost of knowledge, they realized, was heavy. They had paid a significant price for uncovering such a terrifying truth, sacrificing their peace of mind, their scientific certainty, and perhaps a piece of their very souls. They were different people now, marked by the confrontation, forever changed by the shadow of 1910. The final glimpse of the portrait before it was sealed away was unsettling. Even diminished, the shadow remained, a faint dark stain on the woman's elegant dress. It was a permanent mark of its dark history, a silent testament to the malevolent force it had once harbored. The woman's serene expression, once so captivating, now seemed to hold a profound, tragic secret. It left anyone who saw it with a chilling sense of dread, a deep-seated knowledge that some shadows once awakened can never be fully dispelled, only contained, a constant reminder that the past, however distant, can still reach out and touch the present in the most terrifying ways.